Here's where we are in the governance series. We completed phase 1, seeing the system letters 1 to 12. We are in phase 2, designing the system letters 13 to 30. We completed stage 1 through stage 4. We are now in stage 5, preventing regression, letters 24 to 26. We just completed letter 25C, the cost of forgotten alignment. We are in letter 25D, when the scribe leaves. In the previous workshop, we experienced strategic drift. We discovered that organizations rarely abandon their strategic objectives intentionally. Instead, daily decisions gradually stop expressing the strategy leadership believes the organization is still pursuing. This workshop continues that journey. It asks another question. What happens when the people who made the organization's most important decisions are no longer available to explain why those decisions were made? Once again, we will use the executive navigation chart referenced in letter 25A. Do not simply observe this workshop. Become part of it. Imagine you are one of the executives responsible for what happens next. Several years ago, I was invited to participate in the design and implementation of a large enterprise data center. The focus of the engagement was the network infrastructure. The customer specifically requested that I become part of the project. At the time, there were engineers with significantly more senior titles in mind, yet the customer requested that I participate because of something entirely different. Over the years, I developed a reputation for documenting meetings, capturing design decisions, and organizing technical information in a way that allowed others to understand the project long after the meeting had ended. Some people referred to me as the scribe. If someone wanted to know who attended a meeting, what decisions had been made, or why certain design choices had been approved, they would often say, ask the scribe. Documentation was the door that was opened. At least, that is what everyone believed. Before we continue, place yourself inside the workshop. You have been assigned to help design an important customer implementation. Naturally, one of the first things you begin collecting is information. You assume this information already exists. You simply need to access it. That seems reasonable. After all, how can someone contribute to the design of an organization without first understanding the design? One of the first things I did was begin assembling the documentation in order to know the scope of the project. I wanted to understand the customer's objectives, project goals, customer requirements, design documentation, meeting notes, architecture designs, implementation schedules, the design assumptions, the implementation strategy, the reasoning behind the architectural decisions that had already been made. As I requested information, I received an unexpected response. That information is on a need-to-know basis. That answer surprised me. I remember thinking, if I have been asked to participate in designing and implementing this project, does that not suggest I need to know? The response remained the same. Certain information would only be shared with selected individuals. The project continued. Yet something about that response stayed with me. Referencing the executive navigation chart, we have now reached the first stage, experience, an event that allows the organization to reveal something that previously remained unnoticed. At first, this appeared to be a discussion about documentation, but something larger was quietly revealing itself. The documentation was not missing because it had been forgotten. Much of it had never been created. The reasoning behind important architectural decisions existed primarily inside the minds of a small number of individuals. Knowledge had become personal, not institutional. Nothing about the project changed. Nothing about the technology changed. The organization simply revealed something that had previously remained unnoticed. The next stage of the executive navigation chart is calibration. Something is different than what I believed. Until that moment, I assumed the project's most important decisions had been intentionally documented. Now, a different understanding began to emerge. The organization was depending upon people to remember what the institution itself had never preserved. This brings us to the next phase in the executive navigation chart: recognition. The executive begins understanding what the experience is actually revealing. That realization changed the way I viewed the entire project. The challenge was no longer documentation. The challenge was continuity. This transitions us to calibration. We need a way to interpret what we have just experienced. Calibration changes our understanding. I began asking myself a series of questions. What happens if one of these individuals retires? What happens if someone accepts another position? What happens if the customer asks 6 months from now, why was this architecture selected? Who answers that question? More importantly, how do they answer it? The architecture diagrams may still exist. The equipment may still be installed. The implementation may still be functioning exactly as designed. But the reasoning behind the design, the assumptions, the alternatives that had already been evaluated, the trade-offs that had already been accepted, could quietly disappear with the people who carried that knowledge. The organization had not intentionally designed institutional memory. It had unintentionally designed dependence upon individuals. That is a very different organization. That recognition had nothing to do with documentation. It had everything to do with governance. We now arrive at the next stage. Name. Return to letter 13A and identify the structural pattern that best explains the experience. In letter 5 of this series, we explored decision amnesia. Decision amnesia occurs when major decisions continue to exist, but the reasoning behind those decisions is no longer available. The architecture remains. The implementation remains. The decision remains. The understanding quietly disappears. Executives begin asking, why did we make that decision? No one is certain. Not because the decision was poor, because the reasoning was never intentionally preserved. That is decision amnesia. But the workshop does not end there. Decision amnesia is only the beginning. As I continued participating in the project, another realization emerged. If enough important decisions lose their context, if enough experienced people leave, if enough knowledge remains inside individuals rather than becoming part of the institution, the organization begins experiencing something much larger. Also in letter 5, we gave that structural pattern another name: institutional memory loss. The organization repeatedly relearns lessons it had already learned. Questions that were already answered years earlier return. Architectural discussions begin again. Design alternatives that were previously rejected are reconsidered because no one remembers why they were rejected. Projects begin solving problems that had already been solved. The organization is not lacking intelligence. It is lacking memory. Notice the relationship between these two structural patterns. Decision amnesia affects individual decisions. Think of it as the immediate mechanism. It is microscopic. Institutional memory loss affects the organization. Think of it as the institutional consequence of decision amnesia. It is macroscopic. One quietly produces the other. Pause for a moment. Notice how your own perspective has changed. When this workshop began, it appeared to be a discussion about documentation. Now, it has become a discussion about preserving organizational intelligence. Nothing about the project changed. Nothing about the technology changed. Your understanding changed. That is another calibration. Now we have language for what we observed. Documentation is not the objective. Continuity is. The purpose of documentation is not to preserve paper. It is to preserve understanding. Once the structural patterns became visible, the next question naturally followed. Now what? The immediate reaction is often simple. Document everything. That sounds reasonable. It is also incomplete. Documentation by itself does not preserve organizational intelligence. Organizations generate enormous amounts of documentation every year. Yet executives still ask, why do we make that decision? The design resolution encompasses more than just this. This is the design phase of the executive navigation chart. Move from the structural pattern to its design resolution and consult the guidance developed throughout letters 13b through 23. The design resolution for decision amnesia is documented decision authority. The design resolution for institutional memory loss is structural continuity design. The design resolution asks a different question. How do we intentionally preserve the reasoning behind important decisions so the organization does not continually relearn what it already knows? That requires intentional design. Documenting the decision, documenting why the decision was made, recording the assumptions that influenced it, capturing the alternatives that were considered, identifying the risks that were accepted, assigning ownership, establishing review points, transferring knowledge before people transition to other roles. None of those activities exist independently. Together, they create something much larger. They transform individual knowledge into institutional capability. That is governance. Not because governance creates more documents, because governance intentionally preserves organizational understanding. This is the calibration phase. Now we understand what should be intentionally designed or strengthened. Earlier, knowledge may have appeared to belong to individuals. Now a different realization emerges. Organizations never became dependent upon remembering. They become intentional about preserving. That distinction changes the role of leadership. Leaders are not simply responsible for making good decisions. They are responsible for ensuring future leaders understand why those decisions were made. That is how continuity is intentionally designed. That brings us to the final stage of the executive navigation chart, stewardship. Continue guiding the organization with the river, lighthouse, compass, and navigational chart as the organization continues evolving. The purpose of this workshop was never to improve documentation, nor was it simply to encourage people to share information. The purpose was to demonstrate that organizations gradually lose intelligence when knowledge remains inside individuals instead of becoming part of the institution. The engineers who possessed that knowledge were not acting with malicious intent. Many genuinely believed that protecting information protected their value. It is a belief that still exists across many organizations today. Early in my career, however, I was given different advice by two mentors. They encouraged me to work myself out of a job. At first, that sounded completely backward. Over time, I understood what they meant. Share what you know. Teach others. Document your reasoning. Help people become successful. When organizations need someone to solve increasingly complex challenges, they do not usually select the person who protects knowledge. They seek the person who consistently creates capability in others. That philosophy shaped the way I approached every engagement that followed. It also shaped the way I viewed governance. Governance is not about controlling information. It is about ensuring that important knowledge survives long after the individuals who created it have moved on. As you leave this workshop, I would encourage you to ask yourself two questions. If the people who made your organization's most important decisions left tomorrow, would future leaders understand why those decisions were made? And how much of your organization's intelligence currently exists inside people rather than inside the institution itself? This may determine whether your organization continues building upon its experience or spends the next decade paying to relearn lessons it had already learned. This is the description of calibration of stewardship. Stewardship has reached another level of maturity. From this new altitude, relationships that were once hidden become visible, allowing the next stage of the journey to begin with greater clarity and intentionality. Governance is not simply the discipline of making good decisions. It is the discipline of ensuring that good decisions continue serving the organization long after the people who made them are gone. Thank you.